So just kind of to repeat some of the homework assignments, we're doing 10 words every week. And I'm not going to be checking every week, but you're going to get a test. And on that test, you're going to have to properly show that you basically that you have knowledge and mastery of all these words. And also, yeah.
Is it going to be a written test or an oral test?
Written test and oral test. There's two parts to it.
Oh, okay.
It's actually pretty intense.
Okay.
And also during the course of a class, during the course of the course, if there's new words that come up as I listen to the homework assignments and you're missing words or whatnot, I will add it to this list. This is for our benefit, for everyone's benefit here. All right? Okay. So some of the stuff today would be kind of some of it is going to be repetition from last class, but a lot of it is going to be new. So today we're going to be talking about consecutive interpretation. So last time we talked about difference between translation and interpretation. Translation is written, interpretation is spoken. So everything we're doing here is spoken. It's not. We're not doing any written translation in this class. We also talked about the differences between the Russian and English languages. English is very generic. Russian is very specific. The verbs, to get, to go, to put, in English can pretty much translate any kind of, or you can interpret any sort of word or verb that you're not sure of in Russian using one of those combinations. If you cannot think of the real best word to use in the heat of the moment or under pressure on the stage. We also talked about that the English is more analytical and Russian is more synthetic language. English used to be more synthetic. So what that means is synthetic languages have a lot of endings and prefixes. So you can take a verb and you can twist it around. And analytical languages rely more on the order of the verb in the sentence, on the sentence structure to convey the meaning. So, which creates for some challenges. Analytical to analytical language is easier to interpret, but when you have synthetic and analytical. So, for example, you can say, I don't understand what this is for. And if you're going to do it in Russian, if someone says, I don't understand what this is, я не понимаю, что это. Okay? But if someone says, I don't understand what this is, and after a pause they say for, well, that changes the meaning. Я не пойму, для чего это. So что это и для чего это is completely different meaning. So when you're translating or interpreting from English to Russian, it's very critical to hear the end of the sentence because a lot of English can actually negate or totally change the meaning of the sentence at the end. In Russian language, when you're going from Russian to English, it's easier because the verb itself is kind of, because it's synthetic language, the verb itself kind of defines the action a lot clearer. And it also creates for a challenge going from English to Russian because sometimes you have to come up with a specific verb when you're talking in Russian. Anyway, but that's kind of just a repetition of what we talked about last lesson. So today we're going to talk about consecutive interpretation. There are several forms of interpretation. Two major ones are called consecutive and simultaneous. Consecutive interpretation is exactly what the word stands for. It's one after another, meaning the speaker gives you pause, you pick up, you interpret, then speaker continues, and so on. Simultaneous interpretation is where the speaker doesn't give you any pauses, and you're supposed to interpret as the speaker keeps on speaking. It's a lot of fun, actually. The stage into microphones, it really throws the audience into, it's really tough to listen. I've had to interpret some speakers where it was supposed to be consecutive, but the speakers got really emotional, and basically half the time we're speaking on top of, we're over kind of speaking on top of each other. And I could see people are making faces, and it's hard. It's loud, and they're trying to focus one language or another, but half of the stuff is overlapping. It's a challenge, and simultaneous interpretation is not what you want on the stage. And I'm going to talk to you in today's lesson how to control it, how to control the speaker to make sure you don't get in that situation. Not 100% possible, but there's some tactical things we could use, and there's ways to help the speaker give you pauses. Simultaneous interpretation is generally with a booth. So you're sitting in the booth, you have the headphones on, and you're listening to whatever the speech is or a sermon, and you're interpreting into microphone. So we're going to talk about simultaneous interpretation in lesson 3. So that's next time. There's all kinds of things and tricks to that too. All right, so there's a lot of things that are very, very critical, and that are not really, you don't think of it when you step up to interpret, but some of the rules and some of the way of behavior of the interpreter makes a world of difference on the stage. I have, how many of these rules? Like 26 different rules of what to do and not to do on the stage. And some of this we're going to illustrate. I'm going to need someone here to show kind of what's good and what's not good to do on the stage. So, when you're doing consecutive interpretation, you can be in all kinds of situations. You could be behind the pulpit, which is the easiest of them all, right? Or you can have a very active speaker that's doing a lot of this. And walking, and then starts walking down. And as an interpreter, you have to adjust to the speaker. This is your responsibility. I said last time, the interpreter's role is to become as invisible as possible, meaning not be in the way of a speaker, not be in the way of a preacher, and disappear in the audience mind that they can listen to the message and not focus on the interpretation. If you manage to make people listen and correct the interpretation, you really messed up the interpretation. If you manage to disappear, that at the end of the day, a week later, people are thinking of the message, but they don't remember, was this interpreter or not? You've done your job well. So as an interpreter, you have to be kind of like, do everything in your power not to attract attention to yourself. So positioning on the stage, that's where it comes into play. Where do you think the interpreter should stand if there's no pulpit? Let's say there's no pulpit.
I've always seen you stand on the right side, so the right side.
All right, so come up here, Ben. So let's just move this over. You're the preacher. Okay. So you're the walking type of preacher.
Okay.
Start.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you guys don't understand.
Hold on. This is in my way.
It's so big and
Well, the preachers are not typically
bad,
that
not
active.
bad.
But here's the idea. You want to stand to the right or to the left, slightly behind the preacher. And you never, so the attention is on the preacher. You don't never want to do this, okay? You're always going to be slightly half a step behind the preacher. And if the preacher is moving to the right, you're moving to the right. Don't do one of these. You're moving to the right. Hold on, let's stand in the center. Start moving to the right, and I do like this.
Yeah.
Don't crisscross, or especially not in the front.
Yeah.
So it will happen, okay? You'll get a speaker who likes to move, and you have to. Last time we said that you should never be looking at a speaker, okay? So you're looking at the audience, but where you're really looking is here, your peripheral vision. You see the movement happening, you start moving. You see the movement the other way, you follow the speaker. Sometimes it's unavoidable to look at the speaker. Sometimes you just have to do it, especially when there's a lot of movement going on. But as much as possible, look at the audience, not at the speaker. All right, so that's positioning on the stage. When you're behind the pulpit, typically left or right, it doesn't matter. Ideally, the pulpit should be kind of big enough to accommodate both. If not, you have your own stand. And I don't know why a lot of times I stand on the right,
Yeah.
but I've done it on the left too. It's a habit. But also because you also want to pay attention where the monitor is, because you really want to hear the speaker. If you can't really, a lot of sound systems, the person is preaching, they turn right or left, and you're here, you can't hear what they're saying. Yeah. And the audio system is really set up to project out towards the audience. They can hear the speaker, you can't. So I always want to make sure I'm positioned where I can see the monitor, and I want to hear the monitor. And in our church, the monitor is like laying close, and then when I can't hear it, I start using my foot, and I notice the operators always see that, and they realize he needs a monitor, and then I hear the sound coming through the monitor. So you start moving the monitor with your foot. That's like a sign to them. Yeah. Okay, he needs a monitor. Sometimes they don't get it, and you just go with the flow. All right. Always use first-person interpretation. I mentioned that last time. It makes you more transparent. You're not saying, well, according to Pastor Oleg is saying, or whatever. So it's you always use the gender pronouns of the speaker. So if you're interpreting a lady, it's not an issue in English, but in Russian, you have to adjust to her endings. You have to conjugate the verbs in female form. We talked about last time that you have to convey an accurate message, meaning it's not your job to filter the message. It's not your job to filter the theology. You're preaching what the speaker is saying. It's the audience and pastor's job, really, to filter the message. And if there's way too much heresy in the message, it's their job to stop it, not yours. All right? Now, if you're the senior pastor of the church and you're interpreting, that maybe slightly different rules would apply. But for all of us, that's the rule. And then the first-person interpretation also reduces a lot of confusion. If someone is saying, my wife and I came, and she told me that our son was going to be here, but he didn't come. And you start interpreting and saying, he says his wife and him came, and she told him that his son, okay, it's tough, all right? First person always, first person pronouns. Never add anything to the message. It's kind of like the Bible. Never add, never subtract. And that's the other rule. Never omit anything from the message. So you're going to have situations where the speaker is going to add a lot of details to interpret, like synonyms or whatnot. this is where you have to be especially on your toes, because synonyms add a lot of flavor to the message. And if you omit all the synonyms, they'll repeat and say the same things over and over sometimes, and that's on purpose. And you have to. I mean, sometimes it drives me nuts when the speaker does it, and they kind of try to hammer the same point over and over and over, and I am really, really tempted not to do it. But it's not your place to make a better message for the speaker. It's your place to convey exactly what the speaker is saying. And if the message was poorly prepared or the preacher wasn't as ready, that's on him. That's not on you. I've actually done things wrong. One time I was interpreting in one church a speaker that was very, very monotonous and boring. And I could see the audience falling asleep. So I did not resist the temptation. I started adding flavor to his message. I started adding more emotional accents. I started adding synonyms. And I saw opportunities, and I snuck in a joke or two. And they're all smiling. They all woke up. And the speaker is happy that, look, people are receiving it. You know, it's wrong. You should never do it. I mean, I've done it, and only later, that was when I was young, 20, maybe 19. And I said to myself, you know what, I should never do it. That is like compromising the integrity of interpreting profession, of the interpreting calling. It's not your responsibility to make it fun. Do not attempt to clarify what the speaker has said, okay, unless the interpretation is ambiguous in the target language. Going from Russian into English, sometimes it's more of an issue, because in Russian it's crystal clear what the speaker is saying. English, remember, is more generic language, where one pronunciation of one verb could mean totally many different things. So sometimes you have to add something to the message, or add something to your interpretation to kind of clarify what you just said, because in original language it's perfectly clear. For example, мы полетели на Луну. Okay, I used this last time. So the speaker is talking about мы полетели на Луну, and you interpret, and we went to the moon, and then you realize that really doesn't convey the whole meaning, and then you can correct yourself in saying мы полетели. I mean, we flew to the moon. So you added context, you added more corrections to your statement. That's not because of the speaker, that's because of you. If the speaker misspeaks and then corrects himself, there's no agreement. I've heard interpreters teach. There's a lot of interpretation courses. You can watch seminars and stuff on interpretation on YouTube as well. I've heard a lot of people teach that you are supposed to, your interpretation, because the speaker misspoke, you already know what the right thing is. Don't misspeak, just say the way it's supposed to be. Like, for example, the speaker says, and Moses threw the stone at Goliath and killed him. You know exactly that it's not Moses, it's David he's talking about. The person just misspoke. And then he says, excuse me, David. So are you supposed to say, и Моисей кинул камень в Голиафа? Простите, Давид. Or you're supposed to say, и Давид кинул камень в Голиафа? I mean, thoughts.
Sticking true with like your rule that you're not supposed to add anything, I feel like the first one is better.
So my feeling on this, it really depends. And it depends on if is the speaker in a rush, if you see that time is running out, he's trying to go and finish the message, then you're trying to condense your interpretation as much as possible, so then you just use the corrected version. He misspoke, he corrected himself, you just do the correct version. If the speaker is going slow and there's plenty of time, you really want to convey how the speaker is speaking. So sometimes going through misspeaking is actually more, gives more integrity to interpretation. So it really depends. I prefer to, like half the time I would, and if the speaker did not correct himself, and it's a church setting, sometimes I would whisper, "You mean David?" "Oh, yes, David." But so basically follow kind of the circumstances, but generally you want to repeat exactly what the speaker is saying. And then if you really start, if the speaker is misspeaking a lot and you correct the speaker a lot, this can actually change the mood or the intent of the message. Some speakers on purpose make mistakes just to make sure the audience is paying attention. And if you get away, then you kind of totally miss the flavor of the message when you start correcting the speaker. So he can say it and kind of watch the audience reaction, and the audience are like, and he can say, "Oh, you're not sleeping, good, good, good." And then if you interpreted it right, the audience are just going to sit there, and he's going to say, "Well, you guys missed.
Yeah.
Aren't you all, no one is paying attention? I said Moses." Then you're in trouble because you said David. You didn't say Moses. So as much as possible, stick to what the interpreter is saying. Do not conduct a conversation with the speaker. So as much as possible, try not to ask the speaker, "What did you just say?" I mean, that comes into, that's where hearing yourself and hearing the monitors really comes into play. Sometimes the speaker turns to you, especially a guest speaker who doesn't speak a lot with an interpreter, and they'll start saying, "Well, Brother Ben over here, he's such an amazing brother. The anointing of God is upon him." And then you're tempted to say, "No, come on, it's okay." No. And you're going to say, "Yeah, but Brother Ben is here, anointing of God is on him," and just repeat exactly what he says. Right? And that conveys well to the audience. If you really start having an argument or do not try to argue with the speaker either. I mean, I did do it before too. Well, I would argue with the speaker if I interpret something, I know 100% it's right. But the speaker who's bilingual, he hears it, especially a Bible passage. One time I was interpreting someone, and there's an English passage that goes something like, I forgot. How does it go? When an enemy opens like a flood, I can't think of it. Anyway, but in that particular case, the Russian verse was really different. The meaning was the same, but different allegories. It was like distinctly different. And I went with how the Russian Bible says it. The speaker turns to me and says, "No, that's not what I said." And I turned to him, "Yeah, that's what it says in the Bible." And people started laughing. So it kind of became humorous. But at the same time, those situations do happen with biblical translations. Now, in that case, that was the speaker interrupting me. He has the right to do it. I couldn't say, whoa, you're quoting, that's not Hebrews, that's Romans, brother. That's not my place. Do not look at the speaker as the speaker is talking. We talked about it at length last time. If the speaker does not stop, here's the tricky part, all right? Start interpreting at the end of the sentence or at the end of a logical clause. Let me see here if I have it. So here's what happens here. If the speaker does not stop, it is your responsibility as the interpreter to create pauses in the speaker's message, not the speaker's responsibility. You are the expert in the interpretation. You presume that the speaker knows nothing about speaking with an interpreter. And if you stand there and wait for a pause, that pause may never come. So you can, when you're just starting a message and they're starting to speak, as soon as they reach kind of a logical period, you don't wait for a pause, you start interpreting. And a lot of times the speaker goes, "Oh, I'm sorry," because they totally forgot you're there. In fact, when I preach, sometimes I forget I have a speaker, and when the speaker interrupts me, I'm like, "Oh, that's right, I gotta give them pauses." So if you wouldn't do it, you can be standing there for 5 minutes waiting for a pause. It will never come. So it's your responsibility as an interpreter to create pauses in the message. So when the speaker goes, "And brothers and sisters, God is gracious to us, and He's amazing, and He's with us, and this is a wonderful privilege for me to be here. I'm so excited. My family are here. Please wave, guys." And you're like, okay. Well, it's not speaker's fault. It's your fault. You missed the boat on that. So you're supposed to, if you start interpreting and the speaker speaks really fast, and we're so excited to be here, brothers and sisters, and before you jump in. Мы очень рады быть здесь с вами, братья и сестры. And the speaker goes, "Oh, sorry." Then he kind of, now he's going to try to do it 2 or 3 times. And then subconsciously, if you keep on interrupting at the pauses, sometimes interpreters are called interrupters. I've heard speakers refer to me like that. "Oh, I forgot I'm speaking with an interrupter today." You are the interrupter. So after about 2 or 3 times of you interrupting the speaker, and it seems rude, but it's your job. It's really your responsibility, not the speaker's responsibility. So after about 3, sometimes 4 interruptions, something settles in speaker's mind. He kind of settles for a rhythm in the message, and he structures his his sentences for pauses already. And it's really, really critical to catch that rhythm with the speaker. And it's your responsibility to set the rhythm, not the speaker's. So whenever the speaker finishes the sentence, if it's a short sentence, or finishes a clause, you start interpreting. That's going to force them to give you the pauses. Now, a lot of times when they just start speaking, I would give them a little time. And if I see that they're not giving me any pauses, then I interrupt them. So sometimes some speakers like to speak in long sentences. And if you're going to start interrupting them every 3 to 5 words, it's going to throw them off their thought every single time. So if you see that the speaker spoke the sentence, took a pause, okay, so that's the kind of speaker you're going to be interpreting. You're going to be speaking full sentences, which is better anyway. And if he spoke a full sentence, had a period in there, and continued to sentence number 2, okay, then in the middle of sentence number 2, you got to interrupt. And you don't interrupt like, "Excuse me, sir, you just start interpreting." All right, any questions here? All right. Do not make extraneous noise. Well, okay. It sounds normal when you're doing it, but when you're listening to yourself, it sounds awful. Now, if the speaker does a lot of unless the makes sense in the context of a message, like, "And the Lord spoke to me," and I said, So yeah, then you go, right? Because that's, he meant to say it. But if it says, and the Lord spoke to me, and I thought, wow, is this really the voice of God? And then you don't want to be tormenting the audience with the same thing, right? So you cut that out. At least you make interpretation shorter. No double interpretations. One word interpretation for one word heard, unless you're trying to clarify in ambiguous language. So don't add. I've seen people interpret where they will start explaining what the speaker meant. Like the speaker says, "Our Lord is an awesome God and a loving God." And the interpreter would say, "Our Lord is a loving God and an awesome God, but He is the God who's a judge." Like, now you're really correcting theology. So try to keep number of words the same or shorter in your interpretation. Don't add more synonyms. When the speaker has one word, the sky was clean blue. You say the sky was clean blue. You don't say, and the clarity of the sky was amazingly clean blue. You don't add the more adjectives and all that. Because maybe the point of the message was, but there's bombs dropping or something like that out of the clear sky, and you really just describe how beautiful the sky was, and it may not make sense in the context of what he says next. Maintain the same register of the speaker. Raise or lower the level of sophistication of the language in accordance with what you heard. Now this is kind of really a lot more advanced. So if the speaker is using is speaking very simply, you translate very simply. So if the speaker is using a lot of advanced terminology, and actually between Russian and English it's fairly easy. It's easier to interpret when a speaker is using fairly advanced terminology, because a lot of that professional language is just borrowed from English language anyway. But if the speaker says, «И когда, наконец, наступила эмансипация женщин, и они смогли голосовать», you're supposed to say, and then finally when emancipation came and the women were able to vote, and if you say, and finally when women became free to vote, see, now you just really reduced the quality and the register and kind of vocab level of the interpreter. So try to maintain, and then don't go the other way. If they're speaking a very plain language, don't try to show how educated you are. Just try to maintain the same language level. Don't try to show off that you're so awesome. We all know you're great. Speak loudly, clearly, and confidently. I've seen people who come out to interpret, and they're so intimidated by so many eyes looking at them that it's better for you to make errors and mistakes in interpretation, but make them confidently, than for you to look like you're trying to hide on the stage and the Lord is with us. Just speak loudly, clearly, and confidently. If you do not know the interpretation of a word or expression, then then make your best educated guess. So try to come up with, if you understand, it's harder if you didn't understand the word. If you understood what the speaker is saying, but you can't think of the word, just substitute it for something really simple. If you didn't understand the word, but in the context of the speaker's message, you think yeah, it's that word. You have two options, really. You can ask the speaker, "What'd you say again?" which is very interruptive. Or if you understand the context of their message and they're just rephrasing something and maybe you didn't understand, but you kind of like, you can guess what the word is, then you can go ahead and do it. When the idiomatic expression is utilized, you must provide an equivalent expression to convey the meaning and not explain the expression. This is by far the hardest thing to do. You guys know what idioms are, right? The cat is out of the bag. And when you translate, "И кот выпал с мешка," it makes no sense. So ideally, you want to use the idiomatic expression that's in target language that's similar. But it's very, very difficult. Unless you really study idiomatic expressions, I bought myself a dictionary of idiomatic expression, Russian English. There's like 2,000 idioms. I was just reading through them, but you almost gotta like going over that a lot to really get a command of both. And I would say at our level here, there's some that people use a lot, and luckily a lot of those do translate. They do translate well. There's a lot of idioms that are the same in English and Russian. You don't even know those are idioms because we use them in both languages. But if you come at a very complicated idiom, and you know if you're going to say it in target language it's going to make no sense whatsoever, then it's best to just say that what the speaker meant without an idiom, but to convey a meaning, than to translate word to word, and it's going to make no sense whatsoever. Interpret all filler words such as well, you know, okay. So that's also depending on the context. So sometimes the speakers would use the word well in English. In Russian they would use like ну. И я подошел и подумал, ну и дела. Or so some speakers just use well, okay, or things like this to give them pauses, but a lot of times it sort of creates a certain rhythm in their speech. So you probably want to, my rules are to interpret them as well. So because that sort of gives the speech same flavor as the interpreter's speech. As the preacher's message. Follow the story. Remember everything that was transpired in the story to provide proper interpretation. Remember last time I told you guys about the German Shepherd, right? So if you didn't follow the story, you're absent-minded, you're just thinking about what car you're going to buy on Monday, and you're just interpreting, and which can happen. With a lot of practice, you can actually continue interpreting, but you're thinking about something else. It does happen. Following the story is very critical because somewhere half the way through the story, you'll realize that you missed an important word, and you're able to still go back and quickly correct yourself. So if you really pay attention to a message and follow the points and the story, that's going to really enable you to properly interpret them, because you know what the topic of the message is. It makes sense within the context of a topic or the theme of the sermon. Do not do unit conversions. So keep them as the speaker said. So if they say pounds, do not try to change them to kilograms in your head. Miles to kilometers. just use miles, kilometers, pounds. Speaker says, и мы были 50 километров от города. You say 50 kilometers from the city. You don't really try to adjust it to the audience. That's not your role. So here's another trick that I learned. It actually helps a lot of interpreters. Begin interpreting immediately after a conclusion of speaker's thought. Do not introduce pauses. So the trick that I learned is there is a pause between when you are telling yourself to start speaking, and there's a delay between you starting to speak and the sounds coming out of your mouth. And it's about like a quarter of a second delay. So what I've learned to do is if the preacher, like once you catch a rhythm with the speaker, when they're saying the last word, you already start speaking. So, because if you're going to wait till they finish, by the time the sounds start coming out of your mouth, you can miss quarter of a second to half a second. You can introduce these pauses. Like, come on here, I'm just going to show you what that is.
All right.
Start saying something.
Hello, brothers and sisters.
Привет, братья и сестры.
How are you all doing today?
Как у вас дела? Now, so this is me introducing pauses. I wait till you finish, then I start speaking. Okay, now start preaching, and I'm gonna.
All right. Today we're gonna read from the book of John,
И сегодня мы будем читать из книги Иоанна,
chapter 4, verse
4
23.
глава, 3 стих. See, I start speaking before you finish, but by the time the sounds actually come out, you're already finished pretty much. Sometimes you'll interrupt the speaker, which is a good thing anyway,
Yeah.
if they didn't give you pauses. But if you wait till the period and the pause, you're going to add easily, in 50 minutes, you're going to get 5 to 10 minutes to the message, just by introducing those pauses. Do not mix Russian and English words into your interpretation. Stick to one language. If someone says basement, don't say basement. If we're so used to, like if someone says college, you don't interpret as college. You say college. If someone,
You interpret it the opposite of how they said it. What do you mean?
the word college in Russian is college, not college. Or if someone says, and I bought myself car insurance yesterday, you don't say car insurance. You say страховку на машину. Now, it's not always possible because you're so used to using the terms here locally. We don't never, like if we're speaking Russian here locally, we actually borrowed all these English terms and mixed into our language. We don't, no one says страховка, we all say insurance. And how about license? Where's your license? Well, you don't interpret license. Где твоя лицензия? So it's, or if they say, where's your driver license? Well, in Russian, it's not driver license, it's водительские права. So that's why going into English is easier, because you never encounter that. You use the language you're really comfortable with anyway. Remember the first principle of interpretation. Concentrate not only on what, but also on why. And again, it goes back to understanding and really paying attention to the context of what this preacher is saying. When interpreting jokes, don't laugh and then translate. Okay? So it's really annoying when the preacher says a joke and you say, ha 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 ha. Okay, what he said was, okay, if he says a joke, and jokes are really, really hard too. I mean, you can only get them half the time anyway, but don't laugh, all right? like let's say there was a funny story and he got to a punchline and he said the punchline and you're just laughing and the audience is sitting there like, what's so funny? So you're supposed to like say the punchline and then you can laugh together with an audience. If the joke is not funny in target language, make a joke out of situation. You know, this is where sometimes you can tweak the interpretation to still, like for example, if someone says, I don't know, I can't think of it on the spot, but someone says something really funny in Russian, okay, and you're interpreting it to English. And you interpret it as it is, and the audience look puzzled, and you say, well, this is a Russian joke, or like, that's a Russian type of humor, or kind of interject some of those, some kind of like little offhand remark without being demeaning to the speaker, and then the audience can kind of laugh, wow, that's an awkward joke, and they could laugh just at the joke itself. All right. Enter into a character. So remember, you are not you. Abandon your preaching style. However you preach is irrelevant when you're interpreting. Okay? Think of yourself as you are on the theater stage, and you enter into a character of a speaker. Okay? So it's not you that's speaking, it's your character. Like, you guys did theater, right, before or whatnot. When you start playing King Herod, you're free to be not you, right? You're free to be King Herod, and you're starting making things that are really not you. And the same way as an interpreter, you're really not you at the moment. So if you think of yourself as you get on the stage, you enter into character of a speaker, it's much, much easier to do things that are funny. If the speaker starts hugging you, you hug the speaker. If the speaker starts making funny yes or like some motion, you do the same thing because you're in character. And once you understand that I'm in character, it's so much easier to kind of like step away from your conservative self, from your restrained self, from your proper self, whatever, and just be the copy of a speaker. Copy voice modulation. This is elementary, the voice modulation, but it's so many people don't do it. If the speaker is emotional, you gotta be emotional. If the speaker is monotonous, you are monotonous. There's nothing more difficult when you're preaching and you're completely out of sync in voice modulation with an interpreter. If the interpreter is like you're emotional and the interpreter is monotonous, it's so hard to preach. You're really slowing down the preacher. Then you're a real interrupter at that point. So copy the voice modulation. Really pay attention to that. It's actually not natural to do it. You're used to being you, right? And you're gonna convey things in the way you typically speak. Let's say you're interpreting, pastor of our church, right? He's got a certain way of speech pattern and voice modulation. He tends to get emotional sometimes. He starts to like shed a tear or whatnot. Well, it's your job to follow the same voice modulation, up and down, louder, quieter, faster, slower. And try to copy the speaker's pattern of speech. And it really, really makes you invisible if you do that. Copy speaker's emotion in your facial expressions as well. So don't stand there as a rock and the speakers, and the Lord spoke to me. And he said, my son. And you could be standing there. And the Lord spoke to me and he said, my son. I mean, not only your voice, like even if you copy the voice modulation, but your face says, I don't really care, I don't know why I'm here, you're really undercutting the speaker. So again, it's important to follow the speaker's story, to follow the message, to pay attention. And it's really ideal if you can get yourself emotionally involved with the message too. This is very difficult because The speaker has been getting ready, fasted, and all that. He had a life experience that really inspired him to say what he's saying. And you woke up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you show up to church, and all of a sudden, someone is very emotional. And wow, and the Lord is awesome, and the Lord is wonderful. Don't you all see how great is God, is the God whom we serve? And you had such a terrible day the day before. You're like, oh, I really don't feel like God is awesome today. Well, too bad, okay? God is still awesome, and you're the interpreter. You're supposed to do it. He's supposed to step in character and do it. Especially if you're the preacher. We feel like, as a preacher, you don't want to be hypocritical, right? If you don't feel it, you're not going to say things that way. You don't want to be hypocritical as a speaker. That's why it's very counterintuitive to interpreters who are also preachers, because you feel like you don't feel it at all, but the preacher is feeling it, and it's your responsibility to convey what the preacher is feeling, despite what you're feeling inside. Develop a rhythm with the speaker. I said that. So basically, when you start forcing pauses in, after about 3, 4, 5 sentences, usually you will develop a rhythm. The speaker will kind of know when to give you pauses, and then automatically, without thinking, the speaker is going to start giving you pauses at those times. Sometimes the speaker still gets away, kind of gets ahead of himself and starts, I don't know why I have these. I'm like, something is like muffled.
You're using them to
record.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. Anyway, so, all right. So that's kind of the end of my notes here for consecutive interpretation. Do you guys have any questions?
Seems like a very difficult skill to learn at first, but with practice you get that down. All those techniques, because definitely that's not natural for sure, like you said. To practice getting character.
It's a lot of fun actually, and it's not as difficult as it seems like. You go one by one. What I'm gonna be doing is, once you guys gonna start interpreting on the stage, I will be taking notes, and I'll give you constructive criticism at the end. Yeah. You know, I'll approach you after church, Tim. So here's a couple of pointers. All right, and this is all meant to really help you become better, not to destroy you or you, Ben, or you, Alex. So